Welcome back to our grammar videos, and today's lesson is on compound complex sentences. Now this is going to be a little bit more complicated, so let's look at the elements involved. First, we have complex sentences, and there are two different patterns that we went through in our previous lesson. You could have an independent clause that starts the sentence, or you could have the independent clause come at the end. You need to have a dependent clause and independent clause together to make it complex. But if you start with a dependent clause, it's not a complete thought. You need to have a comma and independent clause to finish the sentence. A compound sentence does not have a dependent clause. You need to have two independent clauses together with either a semicolon or with a conjunction. The conjunctions that we used in our previous lesson were the fanboys conjunctions. If you don't remember those, go back to our older videos. Now we also have the idea of a compound complex, the bare minimum. What do you need in order to make it? You need at least two independent clauses and one dependent clause to make the shortest possible compound complex sentence. However, if you get really good at these kinds of sentences, you could actually make pages of just one super long complex compound sentence. The problem is, it's really hard to read. But let's look at a couple of these patterns as well as a couple example sentences. As we just said, when we're making compound complex sentences, you need to have a minimum of 3 different clauses. You need to have 2 independent clauses and 1 dependent clause. Now, what is a clause? Clauses are just ideas. Clauses are just thoughts that we are having. They could be complete thoughts, independent clauses, or they could be incomplete thoughts, which makes them dependent clauses. Now, all of these right now are actually complete thoughts. However, we could link them together using conjunctions, and depending on the conjunction that we use, we could change one of these into a dependent clause. So let's look at a couple of the patterns that we have to make a compound complex sentence. Pattern number 1, we have an independent clause with a conjunction, another independent clause, and a dependent clause. So this means it's a compound sentence with a DC, dependent clause, at the end. So for example, Jane was scared, so Bob smiled, though he wasn't happy. We have 2 conjunctions. We have the fanboy conjunction here, as well as our conjunction for our dependent clause, which makes it a dependent clause marker. Now, pattern 1 and 2, the only difference is moving the dependent clause to the front. So we move the dependent clause here, add a comma, independent clause, comma, conjunction, independent clause, period. The punctuations are important if you want to write perfectly. But here, though Bob wasn't happy, he smiled, for Jane was scared. So we have the dependent clause marker and our conjunction though and for. Pattern 3 is a little bit different because we had compound with a DC. Pattern 3, it's a complex sentence with an independent clause at the end. Now, just because it's a complex sentence does not mean it is not part of this pattern. Because what is a compound sentence? A compound sentence is going to be one complete thought, simple sentence, plus another complete thought, linked together with either a semicolon or a conjunction. This one, this complex sentence, is going to be just like a complete thought independent clause. Just think of it that way. So for example, Bob smiled because Jane was scared. He wasn't happy. Here, if you look at it, this, you could stop, and this is a complete thought. But we're going to add a little more information by saying that he, Bob, wasn't happy. Now, when you are using these different conjunctions, whether they are the fanboys conjunctions or the dependent clause marker conjunctions, when you change the conjunctions you use, you are also changing the meaning of the sentence. You are changing what the clauses mean together. But we can talk about that another time. Let's review.
Intro to compound complex sentences. What is a complex sentence? A complex sentence is an independent clause and a dependent clause joined together. What do you need to include with any sentence that starts with a dependent clause marker? An independent clause after the first dependent clause. What are compound sentences? Compound sentences are two independent clauses joined together into one sentence. What are the fanboys? The fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. What are the minimum requirements for a compound complex sentence? 2 independent clauses and 1 dependent clause. What are the 3 formulas or patterns for compound complex sentences? Independent clause, comma, conjunction, independent clause, dependent clause. Dependent clause, comma, independent clause, comma, conjunction, independent clause. Or, independent clause, dependent clause, semicolon, independent clause. What is another way to write the last formula or pattern? Independent clause, dependent clause, comma, conjunction, independent clause. What generally happens when you change a conjunction in a compound complex sentence? The meaning of the sentence changes, or the relationship between the clauses changes.